Alright, let's sleep. Pull the blankets up to your chin. Fluff your pillow. Turn off your phone and let the darkness settle around you like a soft, warm cloak. Tonight, we're going to travel back in time to a world that exists only in the imagination, and yet, it was real. We're going to the most improbable city ever built by human hands, Venice. Imagine, if you will, a place where there is no land. Just water, shallow, brackish, muddy water, stretching as far as the eye can see. The sky is gray, the wind is cold, and the only sounds are the cry of seabirds and the lapping of waves against the mudflats. It is a landscape that seems designed to repel human habitation. And yet, here, in this impossible place, a city was built. A city of marble and mosaic, of gold and glass, of canals and bridges, of saints and merchants, of power and glory. This is the story of Venice, the city that rose from the water. But before we get to the marble and the gold, we need to understand the beginning, the very beginning, when Venice was nothing more than a collection of miserable huts on a group of muddy islands, inhabited by desperate people who had nowhere else to go. The refugees. It was the 5th century. The Roman Empire, which had ruled the known world for centuries, was crumbling. Barbarian hordes were sweeping across Europe, burning cities, slaughtering populations, and driving terrified refugees before them. The Huns, led by the terrifying Attila, had ravaged northern Italy in 452, destroying the great cities of Aquileia, Padua, and Altino. The survivors fled, not into the hills, where the barbarians could follow, but into the lagoon, where the shallow waters and treacherous mudflats offered protection. They were fishermen, farmers, and merchants, ordinary people who had lost everything. They built their new homes on the small, muddy islands that dotted the lagoon, using whatever materials they could find, reeds, mud, and the stones they had salvaged from their ruined cities. They lived in squalor, eating fish and salt, and they prayed that the barbarians would not follow them into the water. But the barbarians did not follow. The lagoon was too shallow for their ships, too treacherous for their armies. The refugees were safe, not comfortable, not prosperous, but alive. Over time, more refugees came. The Lombards invaded Italy in 568, and another wave of terrified people fled into the lagoon. The settlements grew. They developed a system of government, electing a leader, a doge, to rule over them. By 726, the first doge, Orso, was elected. The Republic of Venice had begun. The salt. For centuries, Venice was a poor, obscure backwater. Its people fished, harvested salt from the lagoon, and traded with the mainland. Salt was their most valuable commodity. In a world without refrigeration, salt was essential for preserving meat and fish. The Venetians controlled the salt pans of the lagoon, and they sold their salt to the cities of the mainland. But salt alone was not enough to build an empire. The Venetians needed something more, and they found it in trade. The lagoon was strategically located. It was on the trade routes between the east and the west, between the Byzantine Empire and the kingdoms of Europe. Venetian merchants began to trade with Constantinople, the capital of the Byzantine Empire, buying silks, spices, and precious goods, and selling them to the courts of Europe. It was a risky business. The seas were full of pirates, the roads were full of bandits, and the merchants often lost everything. But the rewards were immense. A single successful voyage could make a merchant rich for life. The Venetians were not content to be passive traders. They wanted to control the trade routes themselves. They built ships, fast, maneuverable galleys that could outrun pirates and outfight enemies. They established trading posts in the ports of the eastern Mediterranean, in Constantinople, in Alexandria, in Acre. They negotiated treaties with the Byzantine emperors, securing privileges and exemptions for their merchants. And they grew rich. The holy thief. But Venice was not yet a great power. It was wealthy, but it lacked prestige. It lacked the one thing that every great city needed, a saint. In the Middle Ages, a city's status was measured by the relics it possessed. Relics, the bones, clothing, or possessions of saints, were thought to have miraculous powers. They attracted pilgrims, who brought wealth and prestige. They gave a city divine protection. They were, in short, the ultimate status symbol. Venice had a patron saint, Saint Theodore, a 4th century Roman soldier who had been martyred for his faith. But Theodore was a minor saint, and his relics were not impressive. Venice needed something better. In the 9th century, the Venetians decided to acquire the relics of Saint Mark the Evangelist. According to tradition, Mark had been the first bishop of Alexandria, in Egypt. He had been martyred there in 68 CE, and his body had been buried in the city. But by the 9th century, Alexandria was under Muslim rule, and the Christian community there was in decline. The Venetians saw an opportunity. In 828, 2 Venetian merchants, they may have been named Tribunus and Rusticus, though the chronicles are vague, sailed to Alexandria with a bold plan. They would steal the body of Saint Mark and bring it back to Venice. The plan was risky. If they were caught, they would be executed. But the rewards were immense. They bribed the monks who guarded the saint's tomb, and they substituted the body of Saint Mark with that of a less important saint, Saint Claudia. They then hid the precious relics in a basket of pork, a clever ruse, because Muslims considered pork unclean and would not touch it. They sailed back to Venice, and according to legend, Saint Mark himself guided their ship, warning them when they approached dangerous waters. The relics arrived in Venice with great ceremony. The Doge and the people processed through the streets, carrying the sacred bones to the ducal palace. A church was built to house them, the first Basilica of San Marco, completed by 836. Saint Mark became the patron saint of Venice, and his symbol, the winged lion, became the emblem of the Republic. The theft of Saint Mark's relics was a turning point in Venetian history. It gave the city the prestige it needed to compete with the great powers of Europe. It also established a pattern that would define Venetian history for centuries. The Venetians were pragmatists, willing to do whatever was necessary to achieve their goals, even if it meant breaking the rules. The arsenal. But prestige alone was not enough. Venice needed power, military power, naval power, the power to protect its trade routes and its territories. And power required ships. In 1104, the Venetians built the arsenal, a massive shipyard and naval depot that would become the greatest industrial complex in the medieval world. The arsenal was not just a shipyard, it was a factory, a research laboratory, a military base, and a symbol of Venetian might. The arsenal was vast. It covered over 110 acres, and at its peak, it employed some 16,000 workers. It was divided into several sections, each dedicated to a different aspect of shipbuilding, one for building the hulls, one for fitting out the ships with sails and rigging, one for arming them with weapons. The workers were organized into teams, each specializing in a particular task. It was, in effect, an assembly line, centuries before the Industrial Revolution. The arsenal was also a center of innovation. The Venetians developed new ship designs, new weapons, and new techniques for naval warfare. They built galleys, fast, maneuverable warships that could be rowed as well as sailed. They built galleasses, massive floating fortresses, armed with heavy cannons. They built round ships, sturdy merchant vessels that could carry large cargoes across the open ocean. The arsenal was the engine of Venetian power. It could produce a fully equipped galley in a matter of days. It could repair damaged ships and supply them with fresh crews. It could arm the Venetian navy for war and equip the Venetian merchant fleet for trade. The arsenal also embodied the Venetian character. The Venetians were practical, efficient, and ruthlessly organized. They did not waste time on ideology or sentiment, they focused on results. The arsenal was a monument to their pragmatism, and to their ambition. The Empire. By the 13th century, Venice was a major power. Its merchants dominated the trade routes of the Mediterranean. Its navy was the strongest in the region. Its territory stretched from the lagoon to the Dalmatian coast, from the Adriatic to the Aegean. But Venice wanted more. It wanted to control the trade routes to the east, the routes that brought silks, spices, and precious goods from Asia to Europe. And to do that, it needed to eliminate its rivals. The greatest rival was Constantinople, the capital of the Byzantine Empire. Constantinople was the gateway to the east, the city that controlled the trade routes between Europe and Asia. As long as Constantinople was independent, Venetian merchants had to pay taxes and tolls to the Byzantine emperors. Venice wanted to eliminate those taxes, and to take control of the trade routes for itself. The opportunity came in 1204. The Fourth Crusade had been called to liberate Jerusalem from Muslim rule. But the Crusaders had run out of money, and they owed a huge debt to the Venetians, who had provided them with ships. The Venetians, led by their doge, Enrico Dandolo, offered the Crusaders a deal: if they helped Venice conquer Constantinople, the Venetians would forgive their debt. The Crusaders agreed. In April 1204, they attacked Constantinople. The city fell, and the Crusaders and Venetians looted it for 3 days, stealing everything of value: gold, silver, jewels, sacred relics, and works of art. The Byzantine Empire was shattered, and Venice took control of 3/8 of its territory, including the key trading posts in the Aegean and the Black Sea. The sack of Constantinople was a turning point in world history. It permanently weakened the Byzantine Empire, making it vulnerable to the Ottoman Turks, who would eventually conquer it in 1453. It also created a deep rift between the Eastern and Western churches, a rift that has never fully healed. But for Venice, the sack of Constantinople was a triumph. It gave Venice control of the most lucrative trade routes in the world. Venetian merchants now dominated the trade in silks, spices, and precious goods. Venetian galleys sailed the Mediterranean, the Aegean, and the Black Sea, carrying cargoes of immense value. Venetian gold flowed into the city, funding the construction of palaces, churches, and public buildings. The city. What was Venice like in its golden age? It was a city of wonder, a city that seemed to float on the water like a dream. The city was built on more than 118 small islands, connected by canals and bridges. There were no streets in the modern sense. Instead, the Venetians traveled by boat, gliding along the canals in sleek gondolas. The Grand Canal was the main thoroughfare, lined with palaces and churches, a waterway of breathtaking beauty. The city was also a center of art and culture. Venetian painters, sculptors, and architects were among the finest in Europe. The Basilica of San Marco was a masterpiece of Byzantine art, covered in gold mosaics and precious marbles. The Doge's palace was a Gothic marvel, adorned with the works of the greatest artists of the age. The city was a treasure house of art, a museum without walls. But Venice was also a city of contrasts. The rich lived in palaces, surrounded by luxury and elegance. The poor lived in cramped, squalid tenements, struggling to survive. The gap between rich and poor was vast, and the poor often resented the rich. The city was also a center of vice. Gambling, prostitution, and drunkenness were rampant. The authorities tried to control these vices, but with limited success. Venice was a city of sinners as well as saints, a city where the sacred and the profane coexisted in uneasy harmony. The Plague. In 1348, the Black Death arrived in Venice. The plague, which had devastated Asia and Europe, struck the city with terrifying force. In the space of a few months, perhaps half the population died. The plague was a catastrophe. Families were destroyed, businesses collapsed, and the city was plunged into chaos. The authorities tried to respond, establishing quarantine measures to contain the disease. They isolated the sick, they burned the belongings of the dead, and they restricted travel into and out of the city. But the plague returned again and again, in 1361, 1374, 1400, and many other years. Each outbreak killed thousands of people, and each outbreak weakened the city. Yet Venice survived. The Venetians were resilient, and they adapted to the challenges of the plague. They developed new public health measures, including the quarantine system that would later be adopted throughout Europe. They rebuilt their economy, their population, and their confidence. And they continued to trade, to build, and to prosper. The rivals. But Venice was not alone in the Mediterranean. There were other maritime republics, Genoa, Pisa, and Amalfi, all competing for control of the trade routes. The greatest rival was Genoa, a city on the western coast of Italy, which had its own powerful navy and its own ambitious merchant stock. The rivalry between Venice and Genoa was fierce and often violent. The two cities fought a series of wars in the 13th and 14th centuries, each seeking to dominate the Mediterranean. The wars were costly and destructive, but neither side could achieve a decisive victory. In 1381, Venice finally defeated Genoa in the War of Chioggia. The victory was hard-won, but it secured Venetian dominance of the Adriatic and the eastern Mediterranean. Genoa was weakened, and Venice emerged as the preeminent maritime power in the region. The fall. But Venice's glory was not to last. The 15th century brought new challenges. The Ottoman Turks, a rising power in the east, began to expand into Europe. They conquered Constantinople in 1453, dealing a devastating blow to the Christian world. They then turned their attention to Venice, capturing Venetian territories in Greece and the Aegean. Venice fought a long, costly war against the Ottomans, but it could not match their military power. The Venetians were merchants, not warriors, and they lacked the resources to defeat the Ottoman Empire. They were forced to make peace, ceding territory and paying tribute. The 16th century brought more challenges. The discovery of the New World shifted the center of global trade from the Mediterranean to the Atlantic. The Portuguese, Spanish, and Dutch began to dominate the spice trade, bypassing the traditional routes through the Middle East. Venetian merchants were sidelined, and the city's economy began to decline. In 1571, Venice joined a Christian coalition that defeated the Ottoman fleet at the Battle of Lepanto. It was a great victory, but it did not restore Venetian power. The Ottomans remained a threat, and the Venetians continued to lose territory. The end. By the 18th century, Venice was a shadow of its former self. Its economy was stagnant, its population was declining, and its once mighty navy was a relic of the past. The city was still beautiful, still culturally vibrant, but it was no longer a great power. In 1797, Napoleon Bonaparte invaded Italy. He demanded that Venice surrender, and the Venetian government, unable to resist, agreed. The Republic of Venice, which had existed for over 1,000 years, was abolished. The city was handed over to Austria, and later became part of the Kingdom of Italy. The fall of Venice was a tragedy, but it was also an inevitability. The city that had risen from the water, that had defied the odds, that had built an empire on salt and sails, had finally succumbed to the forces of history. The legacy. But Venice did not disappear. It survived, transformed into a museum, a tourist destination, a living memory of a glorious past. Today, millions of visitors come to Venice every year, to marvel at its canals, its palaces, and its churches. They come to see the Basilica of San Marco, the Doge's Palace, the Rialto Bridge. They come to ride in gondolas and to eat in cafes. They come to experience the magic of a city that floats on water. But Venice is more than a tourist attraction. It is a symbol of human resilience, of the power of imagination and determination. The Venetians looked at a swamp and saw a city. They looked at a lagoon and saw an empire. They built something out of nothing, and they made it last for 1,000 years. The story of Venice is also a story of trade, of the power of commerce to create wealth and civilization. The Venetians were merchants, and they understood that trade could be a force for good, bringing people together, spreading ideas, and creating prosperity. They were also pragmatists, willing to do whatever was necessary to protect their interests, even if it meant breaking the rules. And the story of Venice is a story of art and culture. The Venetians were patrons of the arts, commissioning some of the greatest works of painting, sculpture, and architecture in history. They created a civilization of beauty, a civilization that still inspires us today. The lessons. What can we learn from the story of Venice? First, imagination can overcome impossible odds. The Venetians built a city on water, in a place where no city should have existed. They did it because they believed it was possible, and because they were willing to work for it. We can all learn from their example. When the world tells us something is impossible, we should remember Venice. Second, trade is a force for good. The Venetians created wealth and prosperity through commerce, and they used that wealth to build a civilization of beauty and culture. Trade brought people together, spread ideas, and created opportunities. We should never underestimate the power of commerce to improve lives. Third, resilience is essential. The Venetians faced countless challenges, barbarian invasions, plagues, wars, and economic decline. But they always found a way to survive, to adapt, and to rebuild. Resilience is not just a quality, it is a skill that can be learned and cultivated. Fourth, pragmatism is not a vice. The Venetians were pragmatists, willing to do whatever was necessary to achieve their goals. They stole relics, they bribed officials, and they diverted crusades to serve their own interests. But they also built a civilization that lasted for 1,000 years. Pragmatism, when combined with vision and integrity, can be a powerful force for good. And finally, nothing lasts forever. Venice was one of the greatest civilizations in history, but it eventually declined and fell. The same will happen to all of us, to all our institutions, to all our achievements. But that does not mean we should not strive, should not build, should not create. The Venetians built something beautiful and enduring, even though they knew it would not last forever. That is the ultimate lesson, to create, to build, to love, knowing that one day, all of it will pass. The dream. Now, as you drift off to sleep, think about Venice. Imagine the first refugees, huddled on the muddy islands, afraid and alone. Imagine them building their huts, fishing for their food, praying for safety. Imagine them growing in confidence, building ships, trading with the world. Imagine the theft of St. Mark's relics, the daring plan, the bribes, the basket of pork, the ship sailing back to Venice with its precious cargo. Imagine the ceremony, the procession, the joy of the people. Imagine the arsenal, the noise, the smoke, the thousands of workers, the ships being built at an astonishing speed. Imagine the galleys sailing out of the lagoon, ready to fight for Venice. Imagine Constantinople, the siege, the assault, the looting, the triumph. Imagine the Venetian merchants, their ships laden with silks and spices, sailing home to a hero's welcome. Imagine the city itself, the canals, the palaces, the churches, the art. Imagine the beauty, the wealth, the power. Imagine the people, the merchants, the sailors, the artisans, the doges. Imagine their lives, their loves, their hopes, their fears. And then imagine the decline, the plague, the wars, the Ottoman threat, the loss of trade. Imagine the fall, the surrender to Napoleon, the end of the Republic. Imagine the city, still beautiful, still magnificent, but no longer a great power. And finally, imagine the legacy, the art, the architecture, the culture, the memory. Imagine the millions of visitors who come to Venice every year, to marvel at what the Venetians built. Imagine the inspiration that Venice continues to provide, to artists, to writers, to dreamers. Venice is gone, but it is not forgotten. It lives on in our imagination, in our history, in our hearts. It is a reminder that even the most impossible dreams can come true, that even the most fragile creations can endure, that even the most fleeting moments can leave a lasting legacy. So tonight, as you lie in your warm bed, in your safe home, surrounded by the people you love, think about Venice. Think about the refugees who built a city on water. Think about the merchants who sailed the seas. Think about the artists who created beauty. Think about the people who, against all odds, built something that would last for 1,000 years. And remember, you, too, can build something beautiful. You, too, can create something that will endure. You, too, can leave a legacy. Sleep well. Sleep deeply. And may your dreams be filled with the sound of water, the sight of golden mosaics, and the spirit of a city that rose from the water. Good night.